Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of the Community Archives class. By this point, you should be feeling pretty good about the basic concepts of community archives and how important those full relationships are. All your assignments that are coming in really are showing that you all get the concepts, and Erin and I are really loving reading your ideas for community archives. Real or imagined. So keep the good work coming. This week, we're talking sort of about ethical considerations, which also has to do with metadata, as you'll see. So, as archivists, especially within community settings, we don't just manage materials, as you are coming to know. We carry out the responsibility of preserving stories, respecting community autonomy, and ensuring community control across really every layer of the archival process. So, this week, what we're talking about is how to apply what you've been learning about those community relationships to the archival practices in your community archive. We're going to touch on a few main themes, but these really all go back to respecting what the community wants. And that's why those sincere relationships that we were talking about last week are so important. So, this week, we're looking broadly at what we're calling ethical considerations. We're going to talk about how to respect the privacy of those who appear in archival materials and how to proceed thoughtfully and intentionally with sensitivity to your community members. And finally, we'll discuss how descriptive practices in community archives might differ from those in a traditional archive. So, in your readings this week, you're going to read that community ownership isn't just a concept. It's a fundamental value that should shape our approach to the work with community archives. Several of the articles you're going to read are about description, metadata, and access, but those practices come from understanding community ownership and autonomy. Communities own their own stories, cultures, and the knowledge tied to their own lived experiences. And too often, as we know, the communities that we work with have marginalized voices that have systemically been erased from the historical record. So when we work with these materials, we must recognize that we act as perhaps custodians, depending on the model of your community archive, but we don't act as owners because those voices should be represented in the way that they want to be. So this means that communities should guide how their own materials are used, displayed, and shared, rather than we as archivists dictating those choices. I recognize that this is pretty different than what you learn in a lot of other classes, with the exception of maybe TLAM. So it might be a little bit different than what you're used to thinking about in terms of what role the archivist plays. Community ownership also means that we maintain open communication, that we involve community voices in decision making, and that we respect the wishes and boundaries set by the community members. So, this is what we really mean by ethical considerations, this constant attention to community autonomy. This week, you're going to read about how respecting community autonomy can mean respecting the right to privacy, which can sometimes conflict with the kind of open access principles that are associated with traditional archives. And that's a tricky balance to navigate sometimes. This week's readings examine this kind of concept slash conflict in LGBTQ plus archive spaces, but the principles remain the same really across the communities. Balancing access with privacy is certainly one of the trickiest aspects of ethical archival practice. While archives are meant to be accessed, there are often privacy concerns that should be and must be respected, especially with sensitive or culturally specific materials. Access should be granted thoughtfully, and permissions should clearly be outlined by the community itself. In some cases, this may mean limiting access to certain materials to protect the rights, dignity, and privacy of individuals or groups within a community. Informed consent is key to ethical archival practices. And any individual or community who are contributing materials to an archive must fully understand how those materials will be used, displayed, and shared. This is part of what we read about that first week in the Come Correct or Don't Come at All article. One of the principles, one of the very first ones, was about consent and seeing consent as an ongoing relational practice, not just a one time thing. So, this is where that comes into play. It's really crucial to provide clear and honest information, including any potential limitations on control over materials once they've been archived. Respecting that informed consent means that we're upfront about what archiving entails and that we revisit these permissions periodically, especially if circumstances change. And then finally, let's talk about description. Descriptive practices are really the backbone of how archives are organized, searched, and accessed. However, descriptive practices, like many other archival practices, have historically reflected the biases of the archivists who have been writing them. And those descriptive practices have often been shaped by perspectives outside of the communities that they describe. So, in community archives, we must strive to use language and frameworks that are inclusive, respectful, and accurate. I would argue that this is the case for traditional archives too, that inclusive, respectful, and accurate descriptive information is important there too, but particularly in a community archive. This might mean creating new standards that align with the community's cultural norms, or using established guidelines like those you find in the Mukurtu CMS, which also includes traditional knowledge labels to indicate cultural use restrictions. And you'll read about that this week too. Descriptive standards can provide structure, but they shouldn't limit the richness of a community archive. So, for example, using anti racist and anti bias frameworks can help us avoid harmful language and instead use terms that respect community self identity. But these are practices that require us to listen actively to how communities describe their own materials and be willing to adapt our approach accordingly. So this week, as in all weeks, you have several readings, a set of discussion prompts, and part of your community archives project plan to turn in. This week in the project plan, please write 500 words about your plan to respect community boundaries and how you would co-create descriptive workflows. In your community archive, how would you collaborate with the community in creating or modifying metadata? How will you handle sensitive materials? And how will you help ensure that anyone who comes after you follows the same guidelines? As always, keep in touch with us if we can help guide you or answer any questions. Also, we've heard from some students that there was some trouble seeing the comments that we're leaving you. If you don't see comments on your assignments, something is wrong or we're doing something wrong, because we're leaving you lots of comments because we're really enjoying reading your thoughts and proposals and the way you're working through the material. So if you're not seeing comments, let us know and we'll figure out something else. Good luck this week.